Why, hello there. Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools, and on today's episode, we are building a deck, at least part one. If you want to learn how to do it, keep on watching. Let's start it.
Oh, a deck project. Now, I have actually already done a deck project for the BYOT channel, which I'll leave a link for, but this is going to be different because this is going to be a freestanding deck versus a deck that was actually mounted to the house itself. The first thing that we have to do is to actually create and install a few batter boards. Batter boards are placed at every single corner of the deck so you can determine the positioning of the deck, especially when it comes to alignment with the house. Batter boards are extremely simple. All it is two stakes with one 2x4 attached to each other. I'm generally going to make them approximately 18 to 24 inches wide, so you have a good reach and variance when it comes time to laying out your deck. Once I have the batter boards hammered in place in all four corners, I then place a couple screws to indicate approximately where the deck is going to be placed. Nothing has to be permanent at this point, it's just to give you a rough guesstimate as to where the spacing is going to be for this deck. Once the screws are in place, I can then grab a string line and bring it taut against both batter boards. That provides a nice simple visual context as to the size and the shape of this deck. The deck for this project is going to be approximately 21 feet deep by 24 feet long. There's going to be plenty of square footage to really utilize the space in this backyard because there are quite a few elevation differences over this entire span. As we lay out this deck, one of the most important things that we're going to be going back to is the levelness, which is where our laser level comes into play first. And laser level is extremely important when building a deck, especially with a deck like this. I determine the exact height of the deck in which I want it to be placed, which is pretty easy to figure out because you just want it to be right below our French doors. However, once the laser level is up and running, you quickly figure out that one side of this yard is much higher or much lower than the other, which is why I'm installing these vertical boards to determine exactly where true level really is on this deck.
Okay, so we have everything basically laid out over here based upon where the deck is going to be. The string line, surprisingly, is actually very, very level. However, as you can see, there's quite an elevation gain over here because of that. Yeah, quite the elevation gain. But you know what? All of this is going to be going very, very soon thanks to... This beautiful little beast is the Vermeer that actually has multiple attachments. We're gonna be using this for the excavation purposes as well as the concrete jacking and the footings that we're gonna be drilling so we don't actually have to dig them ourselves. This thing takes care of all of that and has all the attachments, which makes life just a little bit easier. Much appreciated. Let's get to it.
I have dug quite a few footing holes by hand, and over my experience, there is a lot of time and energy spent on just trying to dig a proper footing hole because you have to determine exactly where your frost line is. The frost line changes based on where you live, but in my neck of the woods, it's at 18 inches deep. So once we have this ground leveled out, I'm going to be drilling 24 inches deep for our footing holes. I was able to get this machine delivered, picked up with attachments for $500, and when you consider how much time and energy this saved me, it's worth its weight in gold in my opinion, as well as the fact that don't feel afraid that you haven't used a machine like this before. It's very easy and straightforward to use, and the mechanics of it are very easy to understand. As you can see right here, lever, up, down, back, forth, so forth. Very easy to use and straightforward.
So now that we have all of our lines taken care of and aligned, we have to determine making sure that the deck itself is square against the house. Now, one of the key aspects of a deck is making sure it's square off of the house. So we're using the 3-4-5 method, but we're actually gonna be making it and timesing it by 3 because it's such a large deck. So if you take 3 times 3, from here to here is 9 feet. 3 times 4, 12. So take that measurement from here over to here is 12 feet off of that mark. And of course, 3 times 5 is 15. So if I take my tape measure, try to do it by hand, and we'll run it all the way across, you want to make sure that that line is very close to 15. If it is, that means you have a perfectly square deck off of the house, which is exactly what we want at this point.
I position a stake 16 inches away from the house, as well as insert a screw on our batter board at 16 inches also. Then tie a string line, and guess what? We have the center of our beam.
Okay, so we now have our perimeter line taken care of, as well as our footing lines. Now, these specific lines are basically showing exactly where the center of our beam is going to be going. Now we have to determine every single location for the footing itself across each beam so it's properly supported for the joists that are going to be going above it. Easy enough, right? But then we get to drilling. That'll be fun.
For any type of structural project like this, you should take a look at what your local structural requirements should be for joist spans and beam sizes that are needed for footing placements. Because we don't have a lot of space to work with, we're going to be going with a 4x6 beam, which I'd actually normally be installing a 4x8 or even a 4x10. But because we're doing that, that means we have to drill more footings than we normally would. Each footing is actually approximately 4.5 feet from each other, which basically just means that you have to drill more footing placements for each beam. Now that we have our footing hole placement locations taken care of, we can switch over to our auger. This is a 12-inch auger, which is truly a spectacle to see, especially in my mind, because I know how much work this would be if I didn't have this type of attachment. The main thing to keep in mind when using this 12-inch auger is to try and keep it as straight as humanly possible when you're drilling down. It's not always easy because once you hit a rock or a large root, it starts maneuvering and pushing the auger in a different direction that you don't want it. You have to keep that in mind and continuously try and keep it as straight as possible as you're drilling down. There is plenty of leeway though, because the concrete sonotubes that we're using are only 10 inches in diameter, so we have a little bit of room to wiggle around, making sure that they're perfectly straight after we drill our footing holes. Also, key note, especially if you live in the United States, is to call 811 before you dig, because they will actually come out for free and determine whether or not there are any pipes or any other things deep within the ground that you don't know about and you don't want to drill into, because that could wreak havoc on your house or someone else's house, depending on the type of pipe. And just like the bucket attachment, this device was also very easy to use. The yellow lever actually spins it in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction, while the green lever actually pushes pressure down into the ground or brings the auger up. Then, of course, the black lever positions the wheels, and then you can shake the yellow lever back and forth to remove all the dirt once you're not right over the hole. Once all of our footing holes are dug to the appropriate depth, I then grab 10-inch form tubes and cut them in half. That obviously means that these 4-foot sonotubes are cut in half, so they're both 24 inches long. I start placing the sonotubes in each individual hole, but keep in mind that you do want these holes even a little bit lower than 24 inches, because I want to make sure that there's a couple inches of crushed rock at the bottom. Mainly because I want proper drainage, but it also provides a much easier base to maneuver the sonotube evenly so they're completely level at the top. And for leveling, we of course go back to our trusty laser level. I position the sonotube where I think it needs to be placed, and if the mark on all 4 sides is the same, that means that the entire sonotube should be fully level. If it's not, you can always reposition the tube as needed, and once you do have the same measurement on all 4 corners, that means the entire tube is perfectly level and you can backfill as needed. I do have my string line above it, which indicates where center should be on the sonotube, as well as where each footing placement should be with the duct tape. It's okay if it's not perfectly dead center with our string line, but it should be fairly close. At the very end, I do grab my 2-foot level just to make sure that the sonotube did not move on us as we were backfilling, and if it's level, we can proceed to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. This whole process does take a bit of time and effort to do, but it's so vitally important because you want to make sure that you're starting on a good foot or footing. Yeah, nice little dad joke there. Because if you don't have a perfectly level surface to work upon, that means that everything else is going to become a lot more difficult once we start laying our beams and our joists.
So we have all our footings taken care of, and the real trick about this is the laser level. So we have the laser level propped up over here, and it is a perfect alignment right underneath our door. So I calculated out what it would take to get the thickness of the decking, the joists, the beam, as well as the actual bracket itself, which is approximately 15 inches. Now that means that every single mark at the very top of this rim should be exactly 15 inches on the laser level. If it's not, it just needs to be adjusted up or down to make sure that every single side of this footing is at exactly 15 inches, or at least close to.
The next day I pick up a load of concrete at the U-Cart concrete mix. I have featured this type of concrete system before, and if you're able to, this is the best decision you could possibly make for yourself. This is a surprising large amount of concrete, and if I had to hand mix all of this concrete by hand, it would have taken me forever. Luckily for us, we have a pre-mixed concrete that we can just wheelbarrow into place and pour it as needed. As you fill the concrete form up, just be mindful of trying not to fill it too high. I generally fill the form slightly higher than needed because then I can take my makeshift screed and screed off any excess concrete as needed. This way you get a perfectly smooth footing, and as long as your forms are already level, then this concrete is going to be level. Now the one thing you could do if you have the time and the concrete stays soft is to actually insert galvanized foundation anchor bolts into the wet concrete, as long as you can actually dictate exactly where alignment perfectly is. However, I did not anticipate the fact that it was going to be 90 degrees in Seattle today, so I had to quickly remove the excess concrete that was in the machine before I could even get to the anchoring. But got that cleaned up, and the next day I'll show you my very useful backup plan for anchoring. You first want to snap a line across the dead center of all of your footings. Once you have that placed, you can then drill out a hole with your hammer drill. This is a 1/2 inch bit, and we're using 5.5 inch long wedge anchors to wedge into the concrete, but you first have to be diligent about removing all of the excess concrete dust that is in the hole prior to hammering it in place. I hammer these wedge anchors in with the washer as well as the nuts so I can determine the exact height that I need the bolt to protrude out from. Then I remove the nut and the washers and insert the adjustable post base. This is going to be a bracket that is actually a perfect bracket for this application because it's fully adjustable in multiple directions. This way you're easily able to align it properly with all the other brackets down the line. Now at a certain point I was going to jackhammer out all of the existing concrete where those footings needed to be placed and then pour fresh concrete in those locations. But once I actually started trying to break up the concrete, I quickly realized how tough this concrete was, and because this thing's been around for 60 years, I felt very confident that I wouldn't have to worry about drilling into it and inserting our adjustable post base there. We just have to be mindful of the fact that this is a different elevation than all the other ones, so we will have to make a few correctional notches within those beams that are resting on those specific plates. But now that those are in, we can finally get to our lumber. Specifically for the beams themselves, we are using 4x6 pressure treated timbers. And if you're wondering why our lumber has thousands of little grooves within it, that's actually where the machines are putting pressure treated solution into the lumber so it can withstand all the crazy weather that we have throughout the years. However, it doesn't go all the way through the timber, which is why if we do make a cut, we should be applying our own pressure treated solution on those ends that we do cut. This avoids any weak points in our lumber as it pertains to rotting. As for securing our beams to our brackets, I'm using 2.5-inch long galvanized screws that are specifically designed for pressure treated lumber. As I noted earlier, the length of this deck is approximately 24 feet long, which is why I installed the first beam in the center at 4 feet 6 inches. That means the other two beams are approximately 9 feet 9 inches long, which takes care of our 24 feet across. Once the beam is set in place against another beam, just make sure it's tapped all the way down, and that's easy enough with just a hammer and a couple little love taps to make sure it's fully secured and in the right position. I installed the beam next to the house in the same exact way as the first row. However, the middle section with the existing concrete is slightly higher than our footing concrete. Therefore, we need to notch out the height variance within the beam. Luckily for us, it's only about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch on each specific post. Hopefully you don't have to do this step, but if you do, here's how I did it, which was actually fairly easy. All I had to do is set the depth of my circular saw to the appropriate depth needed, and then scored the beam in multiple sections. Once I had multiple sections cut, I then took a chisel and a hammer and hammered out the majority of the lumber. However, the real trick is once you do this, you could then go back and take your skill saw and just run it slightly across gently over that existing space. Using your skill saw as a side cutter like this really does provide a very nice smooth feel to the beam and really gives you a nice even base as long as you obviously set your skill saw to the appropriate height. Or should I say depth? Yeah, depth sounds right, right? On a side note, let me know in the comment section below if you'd like to see plans made up for this specific project as well. I posed the same question for the shed build out and people absolutely loved the plans that I provided for that project. So I'm thinking this would be the same type of feeling, but either way, let me know in the comment section because I am interested. I set and install all the beams in the middle row and decided to do a bit of cleanup because we need to install some weed barrier. You may think we don't need to install weed barrier because the majority of the space is concrete, but I assure you weeds will find a way to grow even through these sections of concrete, and over time I don't want anything poking up into our beautiful deck. Now, if you did this on your project, keep in mind that I did do it the hard way. I installed it after the beams were in. This would have been a lot easier if I installed it prior to the beams going in. Just had to do a nice little notch around each bracket and that was it. But it really wasn't too hard to notch around these brackets. Just keep in mind you'll save a bit of time and energy if you do it ahead of time. One last thing before we start working with joists is the G-tape. This is a weatherproofing tape material that actually goes on the very top of your beams as well as your joists. This is a new application technique, and the reason why we do this is because, in all honesty, now that we have composite decking, the decking is actually outlasting the pressure-treated lumber, which was never the case in the past. All the G-tape on this project does add up to a couple $100, but it's well worth the price in my opinion because longevity is key.
So we have our beams fully leveled out, ready to go. Our weed barrier is in. It's now time for joists. These are 2x8 pressure treated timbers that we're going to be basically spacing out every 12 inches on this particular deck. Not always the case on other decks. You can probably go out to 16 inches on center, but this deck we're going to go to 12. Better start laying some lumber because we got plenty of it.
This is a freestanding deck, which means we're not going to be attaching any boards to the house itself. This, in all honesty, is actually a really nice way to build a deck because of the fact that you don't have to worry about any type of water intrusion or prep on the house itself, which is where most failures occur on any deck. I place the rim joist right on top of the beam and install the 2 outside joists on both sides of the rim joist. Once that's taken care of, I can then mark where all the other joists are going to be placed throughout that span. As I noted earlier, we're going to be going with 12 inches on center, which is easy because all you have to do is make a mark at every foot and place a joist at that location. Once I have my rim joist in place, I can then determine the exact length that I need between the inside of the rim joist to the beam itself. Now, I don't want it to go past the middle beam because of how the hurricane ties install within the system, but we'll get to that here shortly. Just know that all of these inside joists are cut at approximately 126.5 inches. As for nails, we're using a framing nailer, and these specific nails are 16-penny galvanized ring shank nails. These are specifically designed for exterior timbers like this, and the ring shank is specifically designed to make sure that none of these nails wiggle their way out over the years. When nailing, you do have to move the rim joist away from the house, but with a little effort, you can push this entire section back against the house easily and quickly. Just try and get a second hand if you're able to. I installed the second section just as I did the first, but the one thing you have to keep in mind on this third and fourth section is the fact that I want to nail these joists side by side, not butt to butt. All the middle joists should still be spaced out 12 inches, just instead of it being placed on one side of the line that we mark, it's going to be placed on the opposite side of the line. More on that as well later. I kept the outside of the joist long just because I wanted to make sure I had the exact position that I wanted it, because this connection will be a butt to butt. Just make sure you give yourself enough room and you're not sawing straight into your beam. I measure, cut, and install the other outside joist, and then go back to the butt to butt and install a scrap piece of joist, which just gives this section a bit more strength and stability, and it doesn't become a weak point over time. I do this to both sides of the deck, and before I install any fasteners that actually fasten these joists to the beams below, I do one specific measurement that's extremely important.
So the most important thing about this deck is the fact that you need to make sure it's square. And the reason why we did this tape is because if you stretch it all the way from this corner right here, all the way over there, that means that we have that measurement, which is 31 feet, 11 inches. Now, I already took the tape from that corner over to here. I'll do it again, but that is also 31 feet, 11 inches, which means our deck is perfectly square.
Now that it's time to fasten our joist to our beams, the one key factor is how are we going to actually fasten these down? Well, we're going to be using hurricane ties for all of these joist connections, but specifically you should be considering how you're going to nail all of these nails in place, because we're talking about hundreds if not thousands of nails, which takes plenty of time, so we're not going to hammer them down. But we will be using a palm nailer in some very tight-knit areas, as well as this amazing nailer which is specifically designed for this type of installation. It's a metal contact nailer, which means it's actually supposed to be used when attaching metal brackets to wood. As for hurricane ties, we are installing these one-sided hurricane ties on all the outside corners of the deck. But with the joists that are on the inside, we are using these double-sided hurricane ties. I install one of these brackets at every single joist beam location, which basically means every single row gets 3 hurricane ties. Once I have my bracket in place, I make sure and double check my measurements so we have proper spacing. And again, our spacing is very simple in this case because they're every foot versus every 16 inches on center. Once we have our hurricane tie fully installed, I then take my framing nailer and nail the adjacent joist directly to the joist that I just installed with the bracket. That makes this entire thing fully secure, and they're extremely stable because they're both supporting each other. I do this over and over and over again until I get to that middle section where you can see that I haven't actually finished those beams quite yet. I left this connection last because this is also a butt joint, and I wanted to guarantee that we had proper alignment of this entire deck first before I fully installed this section of the deck. Once we have all 4 beams cut at the proper length, I then take my pressure treated solution, apply that to the cut areas, install fasteners all the way along both sides so the beams are connected, but I also take these strong ties to the dead center of these butt joints. That will guarantee that there's no movement at all with any of these joists. And just like any of my videos, if you do like any of the tools or materials seen in this video, I will leave links in the description box below on where you can find said tools or materials. It's a long list. The amazing thing about this metal contact nailer is the fact that the main unique thing about it is that the nail itself is actually protruding past the nose of the gun. This way you can actually pinpoint exactly where you want the nail to go, which means you can pinpoint it exactly in every single hole placement that you want. Very nice, very key, and there is still a safety with this gun, so you do have to be pressing against something in order for the nail to shoot out. Just makes things a little bit safer when using this nailer. But once all of your hurricane ties are fully installed, I go back and apply my pressure treated solution to the ends of the joist, and guess what? We are done for part 1. This might not be a fully functional, beautiful deck at the moment, but I see so much beauty in this project already. This entire structure came out gorgeous. It's extremely strong, it's extremely durable, and I can't wait to get some decking on these joists, but that will be coming up in the very near future. So make sure you have your notifications on if you want to see how this amazing deck turns out. There's a lot of hard work and dedication just getting to this point of a project, but guess what? This is the most important part, because if you don't start with a good foundation, the project is never going to turn out. And that's what I call one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.